right. Thank you for being here. I told the 8 o'clock you are the elite core of Christians who saw what was going on outside and said that you were still coming to church.
Yeah.
So great is your reward in heaven. So today I want to focus on those chapters 2 and 3.
Okay.
We're going to learn a little bit about how Esther and Mordecai came to be in Persia, and then we're going to talk a little bit about exile and what it means to be in exile, and maybe hopefully make some connections to our lives and the world around us. So if you look on the second page, the second page of your the PowerPoint that I had planned to be up here, but can't be up here.
Okay.
So the story of Esther refers back to the exile from Judah, and so it's from the Hebrew galut, which actually we translate it exile. It means forced migration.
Right.
And so I listed 2 exiles because we talk about the exile, but there were actually either 2 or 3, depending on who you talk to. The first one was in 597. Jerusalem hadn't fallen yet, but the Babylonians came in and sacked the city. And so they sent out a first wave of exiles, and those were the people they considered to be the muckety-mucks, well-to-do, a brain drain of the area. 11 years later, when Judah was still, let's say, from Babylon's perspective, they were unreasonable because they didn't give them the money they asked for. And so they came in, and that's when they razed the city of Jerusalem to the ground.
Wow.
They led out a second wave of exiles. There was actually a third wave that happens a few years later, because when they razed Jerusalem to the ground, somebody needed to be in charge after they had exiled the king, and so the Babylonians named a distant relative of the king to be the governor. And if you have a relative of the king and you say you're in charge, eventually that person might try to be king. And so that Jewish governor rebelled, and they came in and killed him and sent more people out of the land. And this is also a time, if you look in the book of 2 Kings, when the Babylonians invade, some of the court, the royal court flee. It says they flee to the west, which means that they actually run toward Egypt, and that's meant to be kind of a bracket on the entire story. God leads them out of Egypt into the promised land. The Babylonians come in to overrun the area, and what happens? The Israelites flee back toward Egypt. And so that's meant to kind of bracket that story. Sometimes that is treated as the end of that narrative. You can almost read the Bible as one set of events straight from the beginning of Genesis to the end of 2 Kings. And of course it's an interpretation of those events, but it more or less flows as one story told through all those books. At the end of 2 Kings, we have a break. And so then we skip ahead into the book of Ezra. And this is about 50 years or so after the exile. I promise I'm going somewhere. I'm not just talking. 50 years from then, the Babylonians had fallen, and now the area was being ruled by the Persians. And the Persian king Cyrus issues a declaration allowing the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. He allows work to begin on building a temple. He allows work to begin on rebuilding the city walls. And so this was, the Bible makes it a major point of celebration, which makes sense, but not everybody chooses to return. Some had built new lives in exile, in new places. Some didn't even know that there was another life. They were born in exile. And so those places were already home to them. And so some of them in their communities felt that pull toward returning to Judah, but some of them didn't. And so Esther is actually, we believe, with the possible exception of Job, but that's a whole different issue, that is written from the perspective of people who chose to remain outside of Jerusalem and Judea. The Bible focuses a lot on the temple in the later portion of the Old Testament. This is one place where we kind of get the minority view. We get a sense of what life is like when you don't live in Jerusalem, where you're not a majority among your nation. And so I want you to keep all that in mind. Mordecai's, we'll find out. Sorry, I just turned the page. Basically, I'm reading what's on the paper.
Right.
So Mordecai's great-grandfather was exiled. The reading will tell us that. His great-grandfather Kish was one of those people who was exiled. So Mordecai has no memory of life in Judah. He has probably the same amount of information that you have on your great-grandparents. I know very little about my great-grandparents. And so that is, his connection to the past would have been through stories that he'd heard, but it may not have impressed in him the desire or the need to return. And they weren't the only ones. There were many Jewish people who chose not to return. About this time, there was a large Jewish community in Egypt. They had formed there. They even built their own temple. And so that's an area that we began to call the diaspora, which means the dispersion, the Jewish people that are spread out across the region. And sometimes we hear diaspora in other contexts now too. Sorry, Jackie, you're here in the middle, but we're talking about the exile.
What time did it start?
9:15, but that's okay. No, that's okay. Basically, we're talking about how the exile lasted 50 years, but not everybody chose to return when King Cyrus allowed the Jewish people to return and rebuild. Not everybody took him up on his offer, because for many of them, where they lived was they had rebuilt lives or they were born in that area, and so it was home. So Esther is probably the only book written from the perspective of Jewish people living in exile, outside of Jerusalem and Judea. Mordecai and Esther have Persian names. Mordecai is a variation of the Babylonian word Marduk. Marduk is one of the Babylonian gods. Esther is a form of the name Ishtar, a Babylonian goddess. And so they have been in Persia long enough that they have absorbed some of these names. So they are living Persian lives as well. We'll see from the story, spoiler alert, Mordecai and Esther have to tell people that they're Jewish. So there's not a physical distinction. Mordecai is not wearing his prayer shawl with fringes. He is not cutting his hair at the temple, so on and so forth. So there's nothing that immediately distinguishes them as Jewish people. They are, are they Persian Jews or are they Jewish Persians? It's kind of the question. So I'm going to read chapters 2 and 3, and if you look on the back here, I just have a few questions for us to think about. What's going on here in this part of the story? What's happening? Why is it happening? Are there things that you find yourself drawn to, either positively or negatively, in this part of the story? Does anything in this story surprise you or confuse you? And is there anything you want to know more about in this part of the story? And so we're going to read Esther chapters 2 and 3. If you have the, did I label verses? Yes, I did. Excellent. So this is all of chapters 2 and 3. Sometime later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he thought of Vashti, the former queen, and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officials in every province of his kingdom to gather every beautiful young virgin into the harem at the fortress of Susa, under the control of Hegai, the king's eunuch and keeper of the women. Let them be provided with cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen in place of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. In the fortress of Susa there lived a Jew, a Benjaminite by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem, along with King Jehoiachin of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken into exile. Mordecai was foster father to Hadassah, also known as Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. She was beautiful and lovely to look at. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. When the king's order was announced, and many girls were assembled in the fortress of Susa under the care of Hegai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women. The girl won his favor, so that he was quick to provide her cosmetics and meals, and to give her the 7 most suitable maids from the palace. He treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Now Esther had not revealed her people or her ancestry, because Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. And every single day, Mordecai would stroll in front of the harem courtyard to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. Now when each girl's turn came to go to King Xerxes, after completing the 12 months beauty treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics, she would go in this manner. Whatever she asked for would be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning, going back to the harem into the charge of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, keeper of the concubines. She would not go back to the king again unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. When the time came for Esther, son of Abihail, who was the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, told her to take. And so Esther gained the favor of all who saw her. And Esther was taken to King Xerxes in his royal quarters in the 10th month, that is, Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the other virgins. He placed a royal diadem on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and courtiers, called the Feast of Esther. He declared relief from taxes for the provinces and gave many gifts as befits a king. Now, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther did not reveal her people or her ancestry, as Mordecai had told her, for Esther obeyed him, as she had done while under his care. At that time, when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs from the threshold guards, became angry and planned to kill King Xerxes. But Mordecai learned of it and informed Queen Esther. Esther reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two eunuchs were impaled on stakes. The whole matter was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his chair above those of all the other officials. All the king's courtiers in the king's gate would kneel and bow low to Haman, for such was the king's decree. Mordecai, however, would not kneel or bow low. The king's courtiers who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's decree?" When they said this to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would prevail. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow low, he was filled with rage. But he thought it was beneath him to strike out at Mordecai alone. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, Mordecai's people, who were in Xerxes' entire kingdom. In the first month, that is, Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, the pour, which means the lot, was cast in Haman's presence for every day and every month, to destroy the people of Mordecai in one day. And it fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, Adar. Haman then said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people, scattered and dispersed among the other people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not obey the laws of the king. It is not in your majesty's interest to leave them alone. If it please your majesty, let a decree be made that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the officers to be deposited into the royal treasury." The king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. And the king said, "The money is yours, and the people are yours, to do with as you please." So, on the 13th day of the first month, the king's scribes were summoned, and a decree was issued in accordance with Haman's command to the king's satraps and the governors of every province and the officials of every people, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language. It was written in King Xerxes' name and sealed with his signet ring. Accordingly, written instructions were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, men, women, and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and to plunder their possessions. The message of the letter was that the law should be proclaimed in every single province and publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that they should be ready for that day. The couriers hurried out by order of the king, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to feast, and the city of Susa was thrown into turmoil. Thus ends Esther chapters 2 and 3. So, I am going to turn a chair over here. And maybe we can just have a discussion about this. This is a very heavy part. First of all, are you okay with being recorded? If you're not, then I will turn it to face me. Okay? You're covered. I should put on mine too. So, hearing that story, was there anything that jumped out at you right away? Any portions of it that...
This destruction of people, lives, just so much of it.
Yeah. And spurred by one person refusing to bow.
Was that their only complaint?
It's funny you mention that, because there's a discussion about that. Haman is son of Hammedatha, the Agagites. The Agagites are a people that are named in 1 Samuel. Saul is ordered by God to kill all of the Agagites, men, women, children, to wipe them off the face of the earth. Saul, in his concern for women and children, does not do it. And God, this is one of the things that Saul does that moves God to say, maybe Saul is not my chosen king. And so, can we make a connection between the Agagites way back in 1 Samuel, we're talking 500, 600 years ago, and what is happening here? It's left open. Does Haman have a grudge that is older than the Persian Empire? That he is, that's older than Israel and Judah? Is that something that's being played upon here? How much of it is Haman's own temper, which, as we just saw and we'll see later, is formidable? But there is some ambiguity in naming him as an Agagite. Is that supposed to point back to a failure in the past? Is this their way of hopefully, by the end of the story, have the Jewish people overturned or finally completed that command from so long ago? It's an open question. There's even a question of, is this actually what motivates him in terms of, when he says to the king, it's not good to leave them alone. What does he do right after he proposes to exterminate them? he offers to pay the king. He offers to pay him off. So there are questions about Haman's motivation. And that's a real concern.
I think a lot of it is his own ego.
His own ego.
He's got a big ego.
He's got a lot of ego, and it only gets better, worse. It only gets bigger through the story. We'll see, especially by the time we get to chapter 6. If you have it at home or you have it here, if you read through it the whole way, Haman is, in a way, he's the most developed character. It's kind of, when I was younger, I had to read Paradise Lost, part of Paradise Lost for English class. And I don't know if this part will get posted online. I hope not. But as a high schooler, having to read portions of it, Satan is the most interesting character. God is mostly a very impassive God. God is the good, and so God is God is steadfast. The devil has all sorts of motivations. The devil is a complex character. The devil wants to work in, the devil will seek out whatever ways possible to make everything happen that he wants to have happen. And in the Esther story, Haman is the most developed character. With apologies to Mordecai and Esther, Haman is the one that we see, he's the one that raises the most questions. And so we can't kind of flatten him. Like you said, what's his motivation? It's hard to really flatten him into, it's easy to say, oh, Haman, boo! But there's more going on with his, psychologists, I think, would have a much bigger day with Haman than they would with Mordecai or Esther.
I've always felt that way about Judas. I think he gets the raw deal.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it was prophesied.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trusted by Jesus because he handled the money. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
So he's painted as a black character.
Mm-hmm.
What he did was wrong, but it was prophesied. Somebody had to do it. And so while he is a dark character, somebody had to do it. And he did. And money was exchanged, just as it was in this story.
Judas as a sort of Haman.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well,
I hadn't thought about that. That's very interesting.
Well, it just crossed my mind. So.
Well, because this raises questions about God's sovereignty. I mean, going over to the Christian story, Judas is stuck in this tension between, the death of Jesus was both this incredible disaster that could have been avoided, but also somehow this redemptive, world-changing event that needed to happen. And so Judas is caught between those two poles. And one of the things about the book of Esther, I think because God is never actually mentioned in the book of Esther, not directly. There's one place that we'll see next week that kind of hints at God's activity, but it's never stated. And so one of the questions is, how is God working in this story? Does God plan this victory? Later Mordecai will say, perhaps you've been raised to royal stature for this moment. How far is God at work? in the things that are happening here? And if so, does that make Haman could Haman be kind of a Judas character? Because that changes that, it reads, this as a folk story, reads Haman as this, as this villain, just villainous. But that raises a good question about the humanity of this character, especially since, I'm always a little on edge when people are punished by being killed. And so I would prefer a story that ends in redemption. And so to have people on stakes in this story it kind of raises that issue in my head. But then, the question of where is God in this? Maybe that's a reason why God isn't actually mentioned in this story. To leave it up to us to figure out and to talk about these things. To tease that out. I think God is here. I think God is doing this. Could God be present in a 180-day drinking party somehow? Who can say? I'm not gonna say yes, but I'm also not gonna say no because the story leaves it ambiguous.
Or a year-long preparation of the women.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm always struck by that. Why they put that in there?
Are there diminishing returns when it comes to the oil of myrrh and the cosmetics? Do we eventually reach a point where, I think everybody's ready?
It's just the idea of all innocent kids, women,
Yeah.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have no power, no nothing. But you got one person making that decision to wipe out the whole group.
Yeah.
When they're innocent, they don't have no say or whatever.
Yeah. And
Maybe that's sort of a cultish kind of thing. Maybe it takes a year to.
And it's interesting.
More than oils.
It's interesting with chapters 2 and 3. Like the king can decree this massive year-long, this whole year-long preparation. And then in the very next chapter, Haman says, I want to kill all these people. And the king goes, oh, whatever, here's my ring. Write the thing. And so, yeah.
Ryan's wrong.
And you think about times in recent history when a whole group of people have been murdered. And that's very disturbing to me. And to most people who have heart.
Yeah, this is, oh, Jackie, I feel like I left you behind back there. You want to come closer?
Come up and sit with us.
Yeah, come up and
Because
sit
I'm
with
not
us.
really hearing.
Oh.
Yes, oh, I'm sorry, yes,
No,
come on up.
I hear you, but I don't hear.
Oh, that's
Yeah, come on up.
Wait a minute. I didn't want to.
No.
No, that's what it's supposed to be.
And if you want to come up too, Joan, that's okay too.
You're fine. There's so much just that seems like on a whim these kind of things happen, and I'm kind of cynical, but when I read the story, I think that Mordecai and Esther will in the years coming be Vashti and Haman themselves.
Oh.
Because they're just now they're in the power positions, in the favor of the king, and it just seems like those kind of stories just keep happening.
Yeah. And that is, spoiler alert, by the time we get to the end of the story, we're ending toward the end of chapter 8. There's actually chapter 9 and chapter 10, a very short chapter 10, that explain that this story is the basis for the Jewish holiday of Purim. But scholars don't believe that part is original to the story. that it's been added as an explanation. And so I'm ending at chapter 8, especially because I don't need to regale you with the intricacies of Purim. But there is kind of a, it's left open-ended. At the end of chapter 8, Mordecai emerges from the king's palace wearing this fine clothing and a golden turban, and he is, he's now the guy in power. It's very clear that power is transferred from Haman to Mordecai. The king takes the signet ring that he had taken from Haman and gives it to Mordecai and says, write what you want. And so there is this, could there be this kind of warning in the story about, Haman? Maybe one of the reasons why I feel like the stake is a little harsh is because I feel like the possibility of Haman is in every human heart somewhere. Who wouldn't want to snap their fingers and make the world the way they want it? And so to do that would then mean that other people are going to have to change, or disappear, or what have you. And so actually having that power, Mordecai emerges from the story with that power. But that's where the story ends. And so we don't know what Mordecai and Esther's next act would be. In fact, in chapter 9, that we're not going to read, Esther asks for another day for the Jewish people to keep killing their enemies.
Oh.
But we believe that's added, because that is unlike the Esther that emerged over the course of those first 8 chapters. So that seems like an explanation for why the holiday is 2 days in some places. And so, but even there, if you were to read that as part of the story, then that does really leave open.
She's got her power.
Yeah.
Manipulation.
Yeah, the question of power and what do you do with power? It's a very good question. Yeah.
I always wondered how, from the time that that decree was made for the 13th day or whenever, how much time was there between the decree and that day? Do you have any idea?
I believe it was about 11 months.
So how come they didn't leave?
Why didn't they leave?
Yeah.
That's a good
They
question.
just hang around for the day and you're going to be killed.
That's a very good question. Is it,
Or is it even spread around that that's what it's going to happen?
yeah, is there
It took
a...
time for the word to be given to all of these places.
Mhm.
They didn't
Big
have.
area.
The word of the couriers, yeah. There is also, in chapter 4, there's a back and forth. I'm sorry, I'm ruining all of what happens next. But in the next chapter, Mordecai says, if you don't help will come for the Jews from another place. This is the reference that some people think is a reference to God and God's activity. Is that something commonly held by the Jewish people in the dispersion, in the diaspora? Are we to think that, we never know the thoughts and the motivations of the Jewish people outside of this one city, really outside of the palace. And so it's a great question. Do they just wait?
Do they believe
Do,
God is going to
do they
save
pick up
them?
and leave? Do they believe that God is somehow going to intervene?
Yeah.
they can't be aware that Queen Esther is Jewish because she hasn't revealed that yet.
Right.
And so, it's a great question. And maybe that's what part of this, maybe that's what the story is trying to do here for its first readers, for Jewish people who are hearing this story. How would I react to such a decree? It says, the whole city was thrown into turmoil. And so, are the Jewish people outside the city, when the news reaches them, are they also experiencing that turmoil? What is the larger response?
Sometimes I think the higher ups, they're making all these whatever. I mean, it's just politics. I don't just let them do their own battles and let it go.
Yeah.
And just not me much.
Stir things up and then let it go.
Yeah. And the king seems to act in his self-interest, but he doesn't work in anybody else's interest. He's
As long as he's got his harem, his concubines.
Yeah.
He's very satisfied.
Yeah. He works on things that aggrandize himself.
Right.
He's happy to throw a feast for everybody as long as it displays the glory of his majesty and people say, wow, what a king.
Yeah.
And he's happy to, I've always wondered how, is it just hyperbole or not when it says he summons all the young unmarried women.
Yeah.
And I think, how many people is that? What's happening in the towns now?
Yeah.
But, he's fine with all those things that build himself up.
And I think in that, what's the one you put online, the Bible story one?
Oh, yeah.
Esther? I think
Mm-hmm.
the point was made in that he was content to leave all decisions, everything to these people that he brought on. And he really didn't, he removed himself from that, kind of just gave that power to other people. Yeah. Just as long as he was happy, content. Yeah.
If we think of this story as, some people think of this story as like a farce, in like the sense of a play, in which the king plays the role of the buffoon.
Yeah.
And so the king has even the things that are in his self-interest, like gathering together a harem. Somebody else made that decision for him.
Yeah.
We don't know who prompted the drinking party at the beginning. We just know that it happened. There is one decision that the king will end up making the entire time. And even that it's not suggested by somebody else, but it's implied. And so it is, the decision's in a very satisfying place. But the king, for the most part, a man of supposedly immeasurable power, is constantly, he can't make a decision. He can't make a decision on his own. He's pushed around by all the people around him.
He can't, or he chooses not to make any difficult decisions.
That's a very good question. That's another, especially when
You force him in a corner, and then he's going to have to make a decision on certain things, and I think that's what the end shows. Prior to that, he just kind of, whatever pleased him, he
Yeah.
went with.
He went along with the party.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even in choosing a wife, the eunuch suggested to Esther what she should take and what she should do to be most pleasing to the king. So the eunuch kind of chose, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because she had found favor with the eunuch.
Yeah. So who is Esther at this point?
She's his favorite.
She's his favorite.
But does she have a scheme behind her too, of being a Jew?
I don't think so. I think she followed her uncle's wishes, and then she did what the eunuch told her to do, because really, women in those days were just a pawn. They couldn't make their own decisions. They couldn't say no to a marriage proposal. It was up to the men in their lives.
That's true.
You know, I wonder if anyone has thought about the fact that what king or anyone else would want to parade his wife around with no clothes?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
I
one.
mean, is that a Persian thing? I don't, what's going on
That's a
there?
drunk thing.
That's it's, what exactly is in, the story implies that it's because he's been drinking a lot.
Yeah.
But it's not, the direct connection isn't drawn.
No.
And so, is this another part of he wants to display the glory of his majesty,
That's what
which
Yeah.
includes,
Yeah,
Because she's the
That's
possession.
implied,
She's not his
yeah.
wife.
yeah.
yeah.
And that is, and that kind of, that rolls into chapters 2 and 3 when we hear about Esther. Because in chapter 1, there is, it's also kind of farcical that the king is supposed to have immeasurable power. He can't even make his wife agree to something he tells her to do, which back then was, a big deal.
Yeah.
The decree ends up being, Vashti didn't want to come before the king. And so her punishment is that she doesn't get to come before the king.
She was relieved.
Yeah.
She got what she wanted.
The men who are there are, the king's 14 advisors, or the 7 eunuchs who go to get her and come back empty-handed, and the 7 lawyers who he consults. They are all worried because one woman said no, that it might topple this entire enterprise. Yeah, it might destroy the entire kingdom. If she says no, then I guess any woman could say no to her husband, and then the whole thing would be ruined. So there's a lot, there's some male fragility going on there. And so the decree is that every man should be master in his own home, which is great because the king isn't even master in his. But then that's the world that's set up for Esther. Maybe the harem is, the harem isn't perhaps, it's not just a way of finding a new queen. It's finding somebody who will be subservient because you have forced everybody into this situation and you are making them comply with all these things. So the king will find somebody who is compliant to what he wants. Esther doesn't really turn out that way later,
No.
but for now, unless I might be wrong, I don't think Esther says anything in these 2 chapters. I don't think she does. I mean, there's a place where it says she asked for nothing except for what the eunuch suggested, but
Not the actual words.
yeah, it doesn't even think to record what she actually
She
said.
doesn't have no wants, it just,
Yeah.
I gotta do what I gotta do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just do what he tells me to do. Yeah. On the other hand, Mordecai, he's kind of, well, let me ask, what do you think? Why doesn't Mordecai bow down?
He only bows to God.
It only boils down to
No one
God.
else.
That's kind of a theme too in the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
for stories.
Yeah. And in the story, that would be, it's left a little ambiguous, but that's what we're meant to pick up on. That's the only place in the story where being Jewish seems to affect the storyline in terms of what you do. There will be times when, Mordecai told his fellow King's Gate residents that he was a Jew, which is how Haman found out. But otherwise, he would have just looked like, Haman would have said, that so-and-so won't bow down to me. And so, what does that mean for, what does that say, what does that say for what he believes it means to be a Jew? Is not bowing down, is that one of the more acceptable ways? Was it taken for granted by other people? Did other people would he not bow down to other?
It seems like that would have come up in
Yeah.
the context that they lived in.
Yeah, the king's been king for
Yeah. and-
between 5 and 7 years. So it's hard to believe that this would be the first time that...
But the king wasn't asking him to bow, it was Haman that was asking him to bow. The king, I didn't think was a very strong king. He just was after the glory and whatever pleased him.
I
It
think
was Haman that made the decision.
it was in the name of the king, though. I'm not sure. I don't have the story in front of me right now. So that is, that raises a good question too. Let's see, where are we?
It's kind of like a Daniel in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
For such was the king's decree. Now, knowing that the king is a buffoon, the odds are good that Haman convinced the king
That's what they
that this
do.
should be the law.
That I have that much power that everybody bows to me.
Is part of, he only bows to God. Could part of that include going back to being an Agagite? I'm not going to bow to these people that God had wanted us to destroy these people so long ago. Is there kind of an old feud bubbling up? Or, it's kind of, this is one of those stories where they give you enough details to form a story in your head, but not enough details to make it, you have to add your own details to flesh it out.
It's kind of like worshiping that golden calf. That wasn't done, and it might come from that. That was really a forbidden thing. You only bow down to God. So I don't know if it stems maybe from that as well.
Yeah,
That you only worship God. That's it. No one else.
that well could. We don't hear anything about Mordecai's interior life, his personal life. In the book of Daniel, Daniel goes to great lengths to, when he prays, he even makes sure that he's facing Jerusalem, because you're supposed to face the temple when you pray, or at least when the temple is built, when the temple's in existence. And so he makes sure that he's facing in the right direction. And so, does Mordecai have this inner Jewish life that we don't see? We know that there have been places and times in the world where that's happened. In 1492, when the Spanish king and queen expelled all of the non-Christians from Spain, there was a group of Jewish people who remained in the country and outwardly professed Christianity, and in their homes and in their community continued to practice their Jewish faith. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility that Mordecai could have some sort of rich inner Jewish life that somehow doesn't come out into the open.
They say how he raised by who?
It just says that Mordecai is the son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. So, and Mordecai is a Babylonian name, but Yair isn't. That's a Jewish name. And so, is Mordecai, did the family reach the point where Yair said, well, this is home now. And this is, we're gonna do the best we can in this place. But the name seems to, if not religiously, at least ethnically, identifying with the Jewish people. Now, having said that, there's one place there's a theory that when it's mentioned that Mordecai is Esther's foster father, that it says Esther is his uncle's daughter, which makes them first cousins.
Right.
Which means, according to Jewish law, he has the right to marry her. And the fact that he doesn't is meant to be somewhat of a shock to the first listeners. That somehow there is either in that refusal to do so, especially right after this story tells us that she was beautiful to look at. That is, some people think that's meant to kind of be a signal that maybe Mordecai doesn't even know what some of the Jewish laws are. That he fails to take advantage of this. Who wouldn't marry a babe like Esther?
Yeah.
So there is kind of that, and it's all left extremely ambiguous.
So basically, when you're raised up, you got some parts of Jewish life, but you didn't know all of it.
Yeah. It's possible that he knew, he knew what you might say, he knew the greatest hits, but the intricacies of Jewish law may not have been known at that point. Now, Jewish people do remain in that general area because hundreds of years after this story, when the Jewish rabbis were starting to put together commentaries, there's a collection of what they call midrash, or commentaries. There's a collection called the Talmud, and one of them is called the Babylonian Talmud. And so they were clearly still in that area. And at some point there was either a revival of those ideas, or perhaps certain people had kept that tradition alive, but not somebody like Mordecai. It doesn't say, we don't know his relationship to other Jewish people outside of his uncle, because he cares for his daughter. So, there is and this is one of the reasons why the Jewish rabbis went back and forth about this story. Is this a book that we should have in the Bible? Kathy Robertson was here last week and pointed out there's kind of an irony. Luther wanted to throw Esther out of the Bible because he said it's too Jewish. The Jewish rabbis wanted to take it out of Scripture because they said it wasn't Jewish enough. Because it doesn't include those references to Torah, the Jewish law, to Jerusalem or Judea. In the book of Daniel, Daniel agonizes about living in this other land. he accepts it as part of his life, but he agonizes about how he isn't in Jerusalem. He makes sure to face Jerusalem when he prays, so on. And this story doesn't really, the exile's mentioned, and then it's just kind of, we just kind of move on. And so I wonder, what does a story like this say about living in exile?
I guess after many years, you kind of integrate with the people. And you kind of be one of them. There.
To a certain extent. Not for somebody like Haman.
No, I mean,
Is Haman, because nobody else seems to have a problem with them at all.
but they would kind of keep to themselves for their true thoughts.
There are still cities that have been preserved that have a Jewish quarter where observances were still communal and so on. Even in New York City, you see there are places where, especially for Orthodox Jews, they tend to be in one place, and there tend to be, outdoor celebrations can happen there because they are all, they're all observing the celebration, and so they can do those things. So you raise a good point.
Do you really think Haman was doing that because of this way back when they were supposed to have killed all the Jews? Or do you think it was his ego again, that I want the power, he disgraced me, I'm going to get rid of him, and all those are there, and he just happens to use that maybe as a excuse to get along with that? I think he's just egotistical.
And you can kind of see that in, it says, one person wouldn't bow down to him, and he was filled with fury. He thought it was beneath himself to strike out at one person, and so he wanted to get rid of everybody. But then what does he say to the king? He projects Mordecai onto all the Jews. They do not obey the king's laws. Mordecai didn't do one thing that was asked of him. May not, since we've talked about the bowing issue, may not have been the only one, but was, because of where he was at that moment, Haman saw him. And so there is, does Haman even let his ego puff up, build up the accusations that he makes? They don't obey the king's laws to the point where it's not even good to let them live here. Over 100 years ago, somebody let them live here, and that was a big mistake. All because one person didn't bow. So it is kind of, in terms of a farce, he is definitely the villain. But in terms of reading it as a narrative in light of the New Testament story, the story of Jesus, it raises a lot of questions about his, not necessarily even his motivations, but how is Haman somehow also a victim, this time of his own ego and hardness of heart? It's a very good question. Well, I apologize that we need to leave it here need to leave that unresolved for today. But when you hear my message, you will hear my particular take. That doesn't mean it needs to be your particular take. You can say, well, we talked about this, and I think this, which I always appreciate when people disagree with me after I preach.
In the middle of a sermon or after?
After, if possible. But I appreciate actually when people disagree, because it means that you've been thinking about it and you've been working through some of these things. And that's just as important to me than, I
Sometimes
don't,
it's just something that lights up in my brain. It's like, well, I don't know. I think, well, what about this?
yeah. And that's wonderful. Sometimes when God speaks through us, it's not necessarily telling us to agree with what was just said.
Well, there's so much I don't know.
Oh, me too.
Join the
Me
crowd.
too.
Use the same thing next week too, right?
Yes. I'll print out more copies in case you
Well,
don't
we
bring
can
them.
I'll bring it back.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you.
Because we got two, not really.